On behalf of the library, I'd like to welcome you here tonight, although it does look like more a Friends of Howard gathering than a Region gathering. And many of you may well know Howard's background, but as a reminder, Dr. Wolpe served for 7 terms as a member of Congress from our own district here in Michigan, then known as District 3, and as a former presidential special envoy to Africa's Great Lakes region for both the Clinton and Obama administrations. He served as director of the Africa program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and of the center's project on leadership and building state capacity. While at the center, Dr. Wolpe directed post-conflict leadership training programs in Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Liberia. He is now retired from the center and serves as a consultant and is working on a book on the Burundi peace process. A specialist in African politics, for 10 of his 14 years in Congress, Dr. Wolpe chaired the Subcommittee on Africa of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. As chair, he authored and managed legislation imposing sanctions against South Africa and overriding President Reagan's veto of the sanctions legislation. He also authored and managed the passage of the African Famine Recovery and Development Act, a 1980s comprehensive rewrite of America's approach to development assistance in Africa that included the creation of the African Development Fund. Prior to entering Congress, Dr. Wolpe served in the Michigan House of Representatives and, of course, as a member of the Kalamazoo City Commission. Dr. Wolpe has taught at Western Michigan University, the University of Michigan, and has served as a visiting fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies program of the Brookings Institution and as a consultant to the World Bank and to the Foreign Service Institute of the U.S. State Department. Currently, Dr. Wolpe is working on a book based on his diplomatic experience with the Burundi peace process and is directing a major post-conflict leadership training program in Burundi. Welcome, Dr. Wolpe.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to receive the invitation from the Library Association to speak here. Oh.
Sorry about that.
No, that's a little better, I think. I was delighted to receive this invitation to speak here. I was just reflecting that I don't think my constituents ever very frequently heard me talk about Africa during the time I was in Congress. I think I was a little bit gun-shy, particularly after one of my opponents came up with the slogan that Wolpe cares more about the third world than the third district. I desperately wanted a different district number in those days, I remember. But I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you some of what I've been doing over the last several years when I returned to Washington after the to be quickly forgotten governor's race of '94. The Clinton administration, and the President Clinton himself, did not want another Rwanda on his watch. And that was the background of the invitation that was extended to me by Susan Rice, who's now our ambassador to the UN, but who was then the Africa director at the National Security Council, and George Moose, who was the Assistant Secretary for Africa, asking if I would be willing to assume the role of Presidential Special Envoy to Burundi, to work with Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, who was the facilitator of the Burundi peace process, and with other diplomats around the world. And then about a year later, my assignment was expanded to the entire Great Lakes region because the war in the Congo erupted. And a lot of the same players were involved in both issues of the Burundi peace process and what came to be known as the Lusaka peace process for the Congo. It was an extraordinary experience. And when I left the administration, when the Bush administration came into office, I was invited over first to the Woodrow Wilson Center by Lee Hamilton, who was the president there, to begin to do some research and writing on the work I'd been doing. But the World Bank then brought me on as a consultant to try to think with the bank about post-conflict reconstruction in Africa's Great Lakes region. And I expressed to the bank my frustration that at the conventional approach the international community had taken to peace and democracy building everywhere in the world. The paradigm was very simple. We put a lot of pressure on leaders to sign agreements. Of course, that did not mean that the next day they saw each other any differently than the day before, or that they suddenly trusted one another, or they suddenly had resolved the issues that had given rise to their conflict. And then we had this kind of template, one-size-fits-all approach to peace building, which involved an examination of Western democratic institutions and wanting to see those replicated in these divided societies. And so we would talk about an independent electoral commission, about a free judiciary, about checks and balances, on and on. You can know the list. And one of the things that occurred to me is that we never dealt with the leaders directly, with their fears, their suspicions, their paranoia with respect to each other. And so I suggested to the World Bank that that was why so frequently peace processes were not sustainable over a very long period, and countries plunged back into war very quickly. And that if you wanted to have sustainability, you had to begin to deal with the leaders directly. And so I proposed an experiment, and we chose as our initial experimental subject Burundi. This was a country which, as you all know now, was deeply traumatized. It experienced a genocide in 1972. It had maybe 300,000 people killed since '94. It had a couple million refugees that had left the country, moving into Tanzania and elsewhere. And though they had signed a peace agreement in August of 2000, no one thought this agreement was going to stick because everyone had reservations. There was no trust, there was no confidence, and there had been no resolution of any of the issues. And so my suggestion to the World Bank was that we try something that would begin to establish a program to bring leaders together so they could begin to collaborate effectively. Now, before I go into that program, which is most of what I'll be talking about, I wanted to say a few words about the conventional wisdom that we don't even reflect upon very consciously oftentimes, that was driving this conventional approach to peace building. One of the assumptions of the conventional wisdom was that the principal challenges that we face in these divided societies were rational and structural. And that's why you had all of this focus on institution building. If you got the institutions right, then presumably you would end up with stability and peace. Oops, sorry. The second was that we kept thinking in terms of peace and democracy building in terms of an adversarial paradigm, where competition was defined as the principal characteristic of democracy. John Stuart Mill's free flow of ideas, exchange of ideas, conflict of opinions in the public arena, and you ended up with the best public policy. A third assumption was that if you brought enough political and moral pressure upon the belligerents to the conflict and combined that with legal sanctions, International Criminal Court, for example, that would be the most effective means of deterring bad behavior. And then finally, well, those are the principal assumptions that drove this thing. I should say that with respect to the emphasis on competition, that was why elections became such a focal point of all democracy advocacy work undertaken by the United States, undertaken by European partners. Elections had become the be-all and end-all of progress toward peace and stability. But this is a competitive environment. And so it struck me that there were a number of things that were wrong with that picture and with those assumptions. First of all, those assumptions misunderstood democracy. Because democracy is a heck of a lot more than competition. If you look at all of the major democratic societies in the Western world, they are characterized by a broad sense of nationhood, a recognition that everyone within the nation has an equal claim. They're characterized by a set of assumptions about appropriate political behavior. There's a certain degree of trust, even among political adversaries, that the rules of the game will be adhered to, no matter whether it's the Supreme Court acting in the political way or not. We still follow the Supreme Court injunctions. And so so you have a set of, there's a sense of common ground that underlies all stable democracies. In addition, democracy depends upon cooperation as well as competition, very simply. And democracy depends upon, as I say, a sense of common ground among the members of the national community. In fact, I would go so far as to say that political competition works only when these underlying conditions are in place. When there's agreement on the rules of the game, there's agreement on the definition of the national community, and so on. Problem is that none of those conditions obtain in divided societies. And most of the transitional societies we're talking about today are divided. That is, there's not the kind of historic sense of common nationhood. Rather, you have the colonial imposition, and most of these countries in Africa became independent only beginning in 56 or 60. And the various components of these nations each saw each other as strangers or as people who were a threat, as people to be feared. There was no recognition of interdependence, no sense of their being connected to one another. And you had, especially when violence occurred, a remarkable dehumanization of outsiders. I just heard today on PBS coming in, the author of the new book on being human or something like that, and in which he discusses this whole process of dehumanization. And moral and legal pressures are effective in a divided society only within the in-group. Because if people outside of your own group are seen as a threat or someone to be feared, then you don't expect moral and political sanctions to apply in the same way. You know, I'm always stunned by the naivete that accompanies our preoccupation with international tribunals to adjudicate crimes of genocide and mass crimes. It's as if people are saying to themselves, folks out there don't understand it's not nice to kill people. And if we just remind them of that by using judicial sanctions, we can avoid genocide or mass crimes. The mass crimes are a symptom of the far more fundamental issue of the lack of connection between people. And unless you solve that, sanctions and judicial processes can play a role, but only at the margin. They will never be central to the prevention of genocide or mass crimes.